If someone's wanting to move to Texas, I'd say come on down.
Thousands of people every day are moving to the state.
Anything that you want to do, you can find here, both Dallas and Fort Worth.
Right from the get-go, you make a lot of great friends at Oncor. Your peers become an integral part of your social life as well as your work life.
We have beautiful places to run, exercise, be outdoors.
And we have a great opportunity to do that in downtown Fort Worth. Sundance Square is a really nice area to relax and hang out.
Dallas has amazing food and amazing activities.
A great arts district.
There's so much local music that comes around here.
Parks and sports teams.
Things to do on the weekends which rival any of the big cities.
Somebody once told me that it's the biggest small town that you'll ever find.
It's just a remarkable place to be.
There are opportunities here that exist nowhere else.
I've lived in a couple of cities throughout my career, but Dallas was just the perfect package.
Also, Texas is extremely affordable, and I love living here because of that.
So if it required somebody to move to Texas for a position, I think they couldn't do anything better.
Oncor especially gives you the best work-life balance for you to experience everything that there is here in Texas.
We're going to go ahead and get started talking about investing in infrastructure. My name is Brandon Formby. I'm the urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune. This panel is presented by Oncor. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the panel's content, panelists, or line of questioning. The panel will last about 40 minutes, and it will include a 10 to 15-minute period of Q&A. And again, to submit questions for the panelists to be read after the panel, whether you're in the room or tuning in online, you can text ASKTRIB, ASKTRIB, to 512-692-0689, or you can just tweet using the hashtag AskTrib. There are Tribune reporters in the audience who will collect those and read those at the end. So let's just go ahead and get started. Immediately to my left is State Representative Ben Leman, a Republican from Anderson and the former Grimes County judge. And then immediately to his left is Will Conley, chairman of CAMPO and a former Hayes County commissioner. To his left is State Representative Celia Israel, a Democrat from Austin and a member of the Texas House Transportation Committee. And to her left is Bill Stockton, Executive Associate Agency Director for the Interdisciplinary Research Group at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. I think I'll go ahead and start with you, Mr. Stockton. TTI does a lot of research on transportation needs. As y'all do that, what do y'all see as some of the biggest needs, particularly in Texas, when it comes to transportation infrastructure for rural communities?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think connectivity of the rural communities to education networks to the marketplace is going to be critical. I've really enjoyed comments made in several panels already about the role that technology will play, particularly the interconnection using a 5G network or whatever it is. And I might mention that while we tend to think of capacity as in how many lanes there are between communities, highway lanes, the availability of infrastructure, technology infrastructure, to accomplish the same goals reduces the need, or at least the criticality of need, for widening additional highways. So there's some real benefits associated with technology infrastructure as you deal with issues of connectivity between communities.
Can you kind of expand on that a little more? Because a lot of times when we think about transportation planning, we think it's all about widening roads, adding new roads, adding trains, things like that. Meeting demand. It sounds like that's kind of more of trying to come at it from a different angle where you minimize demand or try to reduce demand so that, the states or local entities don't have to pay for, such expensive infrastructure. How does broadband access, affect that?
Well, you stated it well. So pretty much every trip has either an employment, an economic opportunity, or a quality of life purpose. So, for example, let's take healthcare. To the degree that healthcare, distance healthcare, telemedicine, I believe is the term that's been used. To the degree that that's been accomplished, then that's for a citizen living in a small rural community because of the broadband access. That's a trip that's taken off of the network. So we don't have to plan for that trip. You multiply that by thousands, and all of a sudden you don't need any more capacity between the communities because you've accomplished the same objective using broadband access.
Let's see, Mr. Conley, you, as the chair of a metropolitan planning organization, your entity and other entities like it throughout Texas is kind of the clearinghouse for a lot of transportation planning, a lot of transportation money. You get to decide or help decide where federal transportation dollars go, and really heavily influence where state transportation dollars go. How, especially in an area like yours that is, has urban areas and rural areas, suburban areas, how do you balance out the needs of those different kinds of cities, those different kinds of communities?
Well, first of all, good morning. Thank you for having me here. That's not an easy balance to strike. My colleagues have heard me say for years that it's all a matter of where you're from. Everybody has to go back home to their own jurisdiction. And in its perspective of a county judge, and for example, or a commissioner's court in a rural county, to a perspective of the city of Austin or Travis County or some of the more urban counties in the area that I represent in the 6-county region of CAMPO, at least from their perspective, they're all equally important. An issue that you're having in Caldwell County is just as important to those elected officials and the people that live there as an issue that you have in a more urbanized area like Williamson County or Hayes or Travis. And so making sure that you set those priorities of the big things, the heavy lifts that you want to do as a region, but at the same time ensuring that those rural areas and their issues are just as important, and that you set aside funds to address their issues as well. We've done that for the past 6 years in the MPO with a great deal of success, and I think most colleagues and members of the policy board and the people that represent those jurisdictions are very pleased on how we have struck that balance. But it is not an easy thing to do when you have such a diverse community. But it's remembering that perspective, and that those issues are just as important to those people in those areas as they are any other issue we may have in the urban area.
Representative, did you want to jump in on that one?
I had a thought about that, and one of the things I know we'd like to talk about today is safety. And last legislative session was yet another session in which we were trying to do something regarding to safety, and that was a statewide ban on texting. So that there was at least a uniform expectation that if you're caught texting while driving, you're going to get a ticket. And the establishment that texting while driving is an unsafe practice. That bill was stuck again. It was going nowhere. And the tragedy that had to happen, or the tragedy that happened in the midst of the session, was a senior citizens bus, the horrible accident that happened in the Bandera area. I think we lost 11 senior Texans on that day because somebody said, oh my God, I was texting while driving. He was in a dually pickup. He was just convicted this last week. That human tragedy woke up the Senate, one senator in particular. It was in her district, and that bill moved forward. But that bill had had a tortured history before then. So, I mean, I'm giving you an example where, yes, we're an urban state, but a rural tragedy, I think, will help move us forward to being more sensitive to the topic of safety.
I'll ask you, Mr. Stockton, in cities when TxDOT builds or rebuilds, large highway projects, you can tell just by the way the physical infrastructure is that there is an eye on safety, there is an eye on, minimizing injuries, minimizing deaths. In rural parts of the state, a lot of times it's just, concrete on ground. What are different ways that lawmakers should be funding, different rural road projects, or planners should be designing rural road projects to make those safer?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure that there is an absence of safety considerations in, particularly in the design and development of highway network, whether it's a state highway network or a local network. And it gives me opportunity to plug the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, which is designed to...
What a coincidence that you have that handy in your pocket.
Yes, how handy. It's a great document put together by all levels, and jurisdictions in Texas to help communities, counties, small cities identify the things that make their highways safer. So I'm not discounting at all Representative Israel's comment about texting and driving, but there are, at least from the design perspective, some really significant opportunities that professionals statewide can engage in.
Representative Israel, on the House Transportation Committee, do you feel like a push and pull between urban-rural needs? How do y'all, when it comes to funding, when it comes to, different aspects that, different parts of the state need, how do y'all balance that?
Well, I believe we have had a good representation from the rural perspective in our hearings and in our interim hearings. We had 3 interim hearings early or late spring, and the chair of the Transportation Committee, Jeannie Morrison, is from Victoria, and so I feel as though the rural perspective is brought forward, and especially when you're talking about things like safety. A lot of Texas highways are through rural areas, and as you were alluding to, as we're being more thoughtful about the assets that we have and making them better, that means incorporating things like a wider median, or my favorite word in transportation is rumble strips, or turn lanes, and being careful about speed. So it is unacceptable that we continue to lose Texans at the rate in which we lose them. We don't have to accept that. But I believe that the rural voice has been heard at committee, and we are addressing it with how we are designing our highways in the future.
During the, as Texas has experienced an energy boom, that's just wreaked havoc on rural roads, not just state roads that TxDOT's in charge of, but also county roads that, county officials are in charge of. In 2014, the legislature set aside $225 million, basically created this one-time grant program to help fix some of those roads. As counties applied for this, it became clear that the need was $1 billion. So not everything got done that people on the ground, local officials at that time wanted. There was a similar bill that died last session that would have gotten at this issue. Representative Leman, I'll ask you, is the state doing enough to help with this problem, or does it need to be doing more? Does it need to be funding more?
Well, as was referenced before, first of all, good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. But as was referenced earlier, that's a difficult calculation. It really is. If you just look at the population numbers, 85% as of 2010, 85% of the population lives in urban Texas, 15% in rural Texas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the infrastructure spending should correlate to those numbers consistently, because obviously urban Texas depends heavily on rural Texas for economic activity and agriculture community. So, when you look at the letting out of projects in 2018 versus 2019, it was 22% in 2018 or 2017, I'm sorry, and then 2018 it's dropped down to 18%. That is higher than the population, but it's difficult to figure out what that magic number is. I can certainly say, as a former Grimes County judge, there's no doubt about it. The oil and gas activity wreaks havoc on these county roads, and that $225 million that was divvied up between a lot of rural counties was a tremendous help. I believe we got about $250,000 in Grimes County to help us. And you have to imagine, for instance, in these rural counties, 600 miles of roads, of that, 400 miles of that is dirt road. And a lot of the oil and gas activity happens down these dirt roads. You add a little bit of rain with a big hundreds of 18-wheeler trucks going down these county roads, and you wreak havoc, you destroy those roads. And the reality of that is most of the consumption of the oil and gas activity happens in urban Texas, yet rural Texas is paying for that road maintenance. So the more we can do there to help rural Texas on that, the better it is for consistent deliveries of the products and of the ag community and oil and gas activity to urban Texas. So I think if we can do more, I'm all for it.
I would also suggest that we don't have to keep doing things the way we've been doing them. If we can get supplies out to the oil field by pipe or by train, let's be smarter about the resources that we have. We have rail systems and connectors that can take stuff from Mexico all the way up to the San Angelo area and connect with the DFW connections. Let's think about all of our assets, not just our roads. And if our roads are getting used less, that's a good thing. And if any of you have a rural interest or a rural perspective and you see a bill that's coming up, it's worth your trip to come to Austin, sign up, and tell your story. There's something to be said for, I'm at the intersection of X and Y. My family makes a living doing this, and I'm here to tell my story. Telling your personal, real story at the legislature is very, very helpful. And from what we heard this year earlier in the Transportation Committee is that it's about heavy vehicles using these roads, but it's also about big, tall, heavy vehicles that someone's trying to get around them on a dangerous highway. No median, undivided. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful with our speed. We have to watch our assets and not think that we can just keep doing it and keep repaving it and it's going to be fine.
I know that in the larger cities, and this is for you, Mr. Stockton, Mr. Conley, in the larger cities, there's like all this attention on autonomous vehicles and a lot of debate about, is that going to solve transportation problems? Is it going to cause transportation problems? How do you see that solving some of these issues and maybe even particularly safety in rural Texas? And how, the two of you, how far out do y'all think we are from, autonomous vehicles being widely adopted?
Well, we've been doing a lot of research into the greater Central Texas area, really from Williamson County to Bexar County over the past couple of years. And I'm sure there are some subject matter experts out there in the audience, but from a layman's perspective, what I have been able to draw a conclusion to right now, in a controlled environment, we have the technology to have autonomous vehicles today, which I believe gets to what we were talking about using our resources that we currently have and having the highest utility out of them, making the best use of the infrastructure that we have and from a mobility perspective and a safety perspective. When you get out of, just to use as an example, say like a managed lane, which is a controlled environment, when you get out of that environment, right now from, again, what I've been told and what I've learned, there are too many variables out there, whether it's different driving conditions, weather, us, etc., for us to just have an autonomous system that fluidly works throughout the entire state and in our nation. So I think at least short and mid-term, any way that we can use that technology in those control environments, both for vehicles and for transit, I think is going to be to our benefit, and then we'll see what happens as technology expands into the near future.
I would just add, I think that's exactly right, and there's been a considerable amount of examination of this in Central Texas, and some of my colleagues have been involved in that conversation. I personally believe we're quite a ways from a largely autonomous system of vehicles. One of the real challenges is that interim period where you have a mix of a very highly automated vehicle in a stream with a '59 Chevy Apache that has no autonomy other than the driver behind the wheel. And how those vehicles, how those operators, the robot versus the human, negotiate with each other and manage being in a stream together over time as more and more technologies find their way into the vehicles. But I suspect what we'll see is a creeping of technology, and we will adjust to it as drivers and then operators and then kind of the human behind the wheel with really nothing to do. It will be more of an incremental change over time, and which allows policymakers like MPOs to make decisions that are informed decisions on their own activities.
Representative Leman, your district is outside of Houston, the largest city in the state, one of the country's largest urban areas. So there's a lot of demand to get in and out, and not just transportation infrastructure demand, but utilities, pipelines, things like that. They have to go through your district to get in and out. What challenges or what problems, does that cause for the residents in your district?
No, that's a very good point. My district sits on the northwest quadrant of Houston, and so it certainly seems like everything's trying to get in or out of Houston to the rest of the country or from the rest of the country. And so we have probably a higher frequency of the use of eminent domain, and so therefore private property rights comes into play quite a bit. It's always on the front of the minds of the citizens in my district. And so the concern there is going to be good governance and best practices that the government sets up to ensure that there's a proper use of eminent domain, and that is justified for a public use. And when you see the variations of different private entities and the variations of the best practices there that are in place, or the procedures that are in place, there's kind of a wide variety. And so ensuring that projects have proper oversight from a state agency that's authorized by statute to have that general oversight, and that there's a process it goes through before a private entity can utilize the power of eminent domain is important to our citizens. It's important that the citizens are made whole and receive just compensation.
When companies do come through, whether it be utilities or energy companies, whoever, and they do begin the eminent domain process, the condemnation process, do your residents feel like they're getting a fair shake? Do they feel like they're kind of, that these companies are being overbearing, taking advantage of them? Do they feel like their private land ownership and their financial interests are protected in Texas?
That's a good question. I think if you look at it in a general level, I think a lot of people have what they would call fair experiences with the use of eminent domain, but there are many instances where we probably need to take a closer look. A great example would be recently, about a month ago, I just had a discussion with one of our citizens here in the district, and they were, quick example, they were offered $75,000 as the official initial offer. They were showed a $15,000 value of that damage and the property that was being taken. They pushed it to a special commissioner's hearing, and they were awarded $475,000. Now, that's a big difference. And having the low initial offers like that, that's a very valid concern, because you have to have proper balance. You don't want a condemnor to pay twice as much as the value of the damage plus the property. But you want to make sure that out of the value that is paid, if it's, say, call it market rate, you want as much of that value to end up in the hands of the owner of that property as possible to be made whole. So finding a strategy that strikes that proper balance can be difficult, but certainly with an initial offer like that, the issue is that the typical deal that's made between an attorney that's helping that individual is that the attorney gets a third of the incremental value that's awarded at the final hearing. And so that, in this case, was $135,000. And so obviously that landowner's not getting the full market value of that property. So that's probably the clearest example I have of some of the concerns. Again, that does not happen every time by any means. But if you're sitting here on the front end trying to design a strategy to ensure proper compensations being made to citizens when eminent domain is used, you would not design a structure that allows that to happen.
We can't talk about transportation infrastructure and eminent domain, especially if you're here, without talking about the high-speed train. That's
my favorite topic.
That's planned between Dallas and Houston. Officials in the two metro areas, they're super supportive of it. They see it as a big economic development boon. All along the route, you have lots of landowners who are opposed to it. And one of the biggest, and you have been one of the loudest, most vocal opponents. One of the biggest sources of opposition is this idea that a private company shouldn't have the power of eminent domain. But I mean, private companies have, in some way or another, with things like utilities, pipelines, used eminent domain. What makes this project different?
So started off with, obviously, I don't believe that the government should be, owning the industries and being public companies doing all these, providing all these this infrastructure like pipelines and all that, like in Mexico, say. That's a big problem. So private entities do have to have the power of eminent domain, and I'm okay with that. It's just that making sure that like my previous statements were, just that good governance practices are being upheld. And in this case, this high-speed rail project is very unique. It's the first of its kind. And I guess I can explain it like this. It would be like if you're in this room and all the lights are out and you're trying to find that door. You're bumping around in the dark without a clear path forward. And that's the situation I believe we have here. There's no state agency authorized by statute to provide general oversight of this regulation of this project. This project does not have did not get federal jurisdiction. They applied for it, and as of today, they still do not have federal jurisdiction, which means the state is the next level of government that has regulatory authority or potential regulatory authority over it. Previously, in the 80s, it was set up where Texas High-Speed Rail Authority, which was a state agency, was provided regulatory authority and general oversight over high-speed rail. After that project didn't materialize, that law was repealed, and that state agency was dissolved. And those responsibilities assigned to that state agency were not reassigned to any other state agency. So the problem that I see right now is that you have an entity that does not clearly have eminent domain. That's very debatable. They've lost 3 court cases where they've tried to seek permanent injunctions and were not granted those injunctions, and it was on the basis of having eminent domain by statute as defined as defining a railroad. So that's concerning when you have a private entity out there without a clear path forward, trying to exert eminent domain of powers and representing that they have them, but there's not a state agency that a citizen can turn to and say, hey, like the PUC with transmission lines, like TxDOT with roads, like Railroad Commission with pipelines. And there's nobody that you can turn to at the state agency and say, does this entity have or do they not have eminent domain? So it's important for the private entity, it's important for fair treatment of our citizens, that when an entity wants to use eminent domain, that there is a clear, transparent path forward that does several things: provides just compensation in a timely manner, but also provides a process that everybody knows what is happening, where everybody knows what is happening, and everybody can understand with a tremendous amount of transparency what the steps are to arrive at a conclusion. This project does or does not have eminent domain and can or cannot move forward.
Mr. Conley, besides transportation infrastructure, what are, I mean, whether it comes to water, whether it comes to, thank you, sir, whether it comes to utilities, what are some of the most glaring needs that you think rural communities face? And also, what do you wish that the state or federal government would be more aware of and help with?
Well, I understand the complication in this statement, but you know, I'm one that believes that the public sector, particularly our state, coordinated with counties and municipalities, that we should have far more what I call common corridors created throughout our state. Corridors that have multiple uses, that can carry, have a transportation use, have a use of utilities. I know throughout all of Texas, particularly in rural Texas, I mean, we have a huge issue of getting fiber and internet access across our state. I think you can design it and develop it in a way that incentivize people to use these public corridors in a way that would be fair and balanced to people, good for business, good for the public, a good investment for the public. Because when, in my experience, I represent, for example, counties on Region L, one of the water planning organizations in our state. And one of their biggest complaints is, particularly east of where I live in Hayes County, they have 10,000 different organizations having 10,000 different alignments and routes running through their counties and their cities. And they're like, well, can't we just have like one or two? And we understand that. We accept that. We know the growth that's being driven in Central Texas is going to drive the need for, in this case, in the counties to the east of us, predominantly in Central Texas, is water. That's going to drive a lot of that. We're reasonable people, but our landowners are being bombarded every day with right of easements, threat of eminent domain, and here's one or two corridors where this would make a lot of sense, and those different private and public entities could share those corridors. I think that would be a smart, good investment in the state of Texas. And in regards to funding things, again, understand it's a complicated subject, but I grew up in the oil and gas industry on the supply side. My father's job was to build it up in good times and break it down in bad times. And as starting as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, I got sent to oil field supply stores to close them down with a group of people and ship inventory back to Houston. And it really always had an impact on me to see how quickly those communities were changing. And how they would be up so high and come down so quickly. And I think our funding for our transportation system in the rural counties, particularly off any services, taxes, fees associated with the energy sector, should be dedicated. We should figure out a way to structure something that's dedicated to those rural counties to meet the demands in the high times. And because it's fluid, it would make it less political, and it would really, all that money that's coming into our state from that energy sector, it would be properly applied to those counties that are dealing with those issues in that particular piece of time.
I'm going to steal a question from my colleague, the last one she had. I really like this one, and it's to all four of you. What are you going to be watching for in the upcoming legislative session? And representatives, if you kind of want to tailor that to, what's going to be your biggest priority in the upcoming legislative session when it comes to infrastructure and rural communities?
You know, would you like to go first? You want me?
Go, please, Mark.
I was trying to think. I was trying to buy a little more time, but No, I'll go first. In this campaign, I mean, it's tied to it, certainly infrastructure, because infrastructure leads to more development if it's done properly. And so property taxes is a huge one for rural Texas. I know it was talked about quite a bit earlier, the previous session, but I think that's a big one. One of the biggest, again, for my district is going to be private property rights, and the use of eminent domain certainly is a big one as well because of all the development. I want to go back to one other thing that I think is important regarding to the types of infrastructure. I couldn't agree more with the gentleman at the end of the table that the superhighway infrastructure, the internet, I mean, that is, the information superhighway is just as critical as physical roads. When I was county judge and I worked with our commissioners court, and we all worked together with the Brazos Valley Council of Governments and did a first of its kind grant program with the federal government, got a $40 million grant to put two fiber rings throughout the entire 7-county region, where we'll be able to partner with private industry to bring broadband to local communities. And I think that is one of the most critical types of infrastructure that's needed in rural Texas to make sure it doesn't get left behind, especially in rural Texas districts like mine that are very close to Houston, where the jobs are, where they can go once a week to the office and decrease the demand on the roads, as was also described earlier, but be able to work from home with functional internet. And that is probably, in my view, the biggest barrier to economic development and rural Texas, and preventing rural Texas from staying up with urban Texas when it comes to economic opportunities.
I have a similar kind of two-part answer, and that is I'm a transportation chick. That's what I love to do. But I cannot deny that this state, two-year cycle after two-year cycle, continues to ignore our public school finance system and push it off on the locals and say, we're great, balanced budget, do what you need to do. And I see Jimmy Don Aycock in the audience here, and we sure do miss him and his heart and soul for what I just stated. So I feel as though we're tired of blue ribbon committees and we're tired of well-wishing, and I think people like me who work on transportation are going to have to recalibrate our priorities and say it's time for us to push in one direction when it comes to the two-pronged dilemma of property taxes and public school finance. So that's one issue. On a personal note, I firmly believe in telecommuting. I firmly believe that it is one way for us to save money. My district is suburbs and rural. A lot of people in my area, which is just outside of Austin, they work for the state or they work for UT, and they would love to be able to stay home 1 or 2 days or 3 days a week, stay in their pajamas, and be just as productive as if they hustled into Austin, for an hour-and-a-half commute. So I want to be able to support that. That bill was vetoed by Governor Abbott 4 years ago. And last session, I just didn't have the heart to have my beautiful baby get vetoed again, so I didn't do it. But there's things that we can do to help Texans that don't cost us a dime. And now that we have more balance, partisan balance, I'm hoping that we'll have more opportunities for us to be the Texas of my youth. I remember when things were not broken down between Republicans and Democrats, but good ideas and not so good ideas. So this session, I think, is an opportunity for us to begin to push in one direction.
Mr. Conley?
Well, I'll just add that I think if people can,
Thank you very much.
If not only if people can stay at home more, that'll help our society and so many cultural issues as well, and strengthen the families, which I think our society desperately needs right now. I mean, the ad valorem system is working exactly the way in which the state designed it. You can't have a discussion about property taxes without addressing public education, and I think that's more of what we've seen over the last few years. Counties, municipalities, special districts, all have a responsibility. Local school districts have a responsibility to come to the table and to discuss these issues openly and look for ways to improve their services. But you have to have that discussion about public education as well. I'm biased to county government. Representative, you being a former judge, county governments across our state are blue-collar people of this state. You're going to find, like any budget, you're going to find some access, but you're not going to find a whole lot in county budgets. It's just not there. I don't care if you're a Democratic county or Republican county. It's just the way it is. And but at the same time, counties need to come and talk about ways to improve. I'm worried about us losing the autonomy of our local jurisdictions. I think that is essential. When you live in a large, diverse, great state like ours, I don't believe there are a whole lot of things that you can dictate and govern in the proper way that reflects your community from Austin. I think it's best held in the region and within the local communities. And I believe those local officials, I think everybody here has been a local official or is a local official at some point in time. If you don't believe that we're not held accountable, come visit the precinct I used to represent at some point in time. We'd have like 10 workshops going through the grocery store every time. It's the most accountable government we have. It's closest to the people. There's far less interest in it. There's not a lot of middlemen. So the dollars are going directly into the community and be invested directly into the community and directly benefiting the people that you represent. I think that's essential to preserve in our state, and I hope the legislature figures out ways to reform some of our taxing issues and to preserve the autonomy of local jurisdictions.
Mr. Stockton.
Thank you. Well, I'm blessed to be part of the Texas A&M University system led by our Chancellor, John Sharp, who is really incredible at his ability to vision the kinds of things that benefit Texas, and that's always his focus. Today, Vice Chancellor Otto is here, who guides us in our legislative priorities, some of them exceptional items in the parlance of higher education. And the one that I think is most relevant to this panel in particular is one from my organization, TTI, the restoration of the Policy Research Center. And the focus of that is to take the kinds of issues that we've talked about today and provide a resource for objective analysis to serve the legislators and answer their questions and give them a basis for making informed decisions.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and kick it to audience Q&A. Again, if you want to ask a question, you can text Ask Trib and then your question to 512-692-0689, or you can just tweet using the hashtag AskTrib.
Somebody wrote in or texted in, speaker last night mentioned possible bill to route portion of mineral severance taxes to rural road repairs. Your thoughts?
I think we should look at that. We have something in Texas which is called the Economic Stabilization Fund that is largely driven by oil and gas revenues and has over the years gotten the name the Rainy Day Fund. There's several of us who have been saying it's raining, and last session Comptroller Paxton actually called us out as a body and said, we have too much money. Our bond rating is being hurt because we have too much cash. It doesn't look good that you have so much money. By the time this session will be upon us, we'll have $11 billion in there. So I wish that we had more Republicans in the world like Will Conley who can support smart Democrats like me, and we could do good things. But taking the source of our economic strength, which is we're not just an oil and gas state anymore, but when times are good, why not capture that money and funnel it? And I think the taxpayers want us to be smart with the money. And That doesn't mean grab it and spend it immediately. It could mean grab it and build up for big infrastructure projects, which cost a lot of money, and then 2 or 3 years later, it gets targeted for something tangible. I think that's what our taxpayers want us to know, want to know about it. So I think it's a good idea, and it takes me back to the Economic Stabilization Fund, where oil and gas money largely goes.
Dina with the Texas State Library writes, how do you address the issue of elderly disabled populations living in rural areas that need transportation? She says she has a list of some resources, but she knows that more needs to be accomplished in this area.
Mr. Stone.
Is it transportation in particular, or
Yeah.
healthcare?
Transportation. I'm sure that obviously ties in with access to healthcare.
Mr. Conley or Mr. Stockton, do y'all, or Representative Leman?
Well, I can add a little bit to it. When I was county judge, I mean, certainly Grimes County was a largely a retirement community, and so there were a mixture of private entities and public entities that provided transit. The local governments, our county added a bus there and a driver to help meet that demand. Our commissioners court did. But there's a lot that is unmet with respect to transportation needs. You're talking about everything from medical needs to just getting groceries to running the errands, where a lot of times there's elderly people out in the rural area that can't drive and don't have a lot of family there to be able to help them get to where they need to be. And I do believe, for the aspect of society that is not able to literally help themselves, we do have an obligation to help assist those in need of that in situations like that. So making sure we meet that demand is in my view, very important.
Thank you.
And I might add, they're exactly right. There is a plethora of services available, but it's very hard to navigate and for the individual to find the thing that the opportunity that best suits their needs. So I know there's a group as a part of the Texas Innovation Alliance. These are professionals. One of them is an MPO director from Bryan College Station, who are working on a model that would simplify significantly the ability to find services available, whether it's for healthcare related or other basic needs, for rural Texans to be able to access the communities nearest to them to receive services and develop a mechanism that allows them to do that.
Expanding upon the brief discussion surrounding water quality, we got a tweet from Inez who asks, given that rural water systems are in disrepair, how do we best address our water quality issues in Texas?
From a transportation standpoint?
No, as far as infrastructure and just...
Are we talking about water treatment plants in rural Texas? I mean, or are we talking about just water?
Water quality. So yeah, water
well,
treatment.
I drink out of my water well, and it's just fine. I don't know. No, I mean, I haven't heard too much of a concern as on the campaign trail in rural Texas, in my district, about water quality. What I've really been focused on is water demand and the difference between the demands that are being placed on water from urban Texas and the source of a lot of water in rural Texas and the struggle for water rights. And I guess I can summarize some of it like this, where, say, for instance, the Colorado River goes right through my district, and from Austin west, there's several reservoirs and dams that are constructed and to service the citizens called the Highland area, but below Austin, where all the rainfall is, there's not any reservoirs on the Colorado River, and that's kind of baffling because that water really gets stretched in three ways: the highland demand, but also industrial demand down in Houston, and also ag demand, rice farmers and things like that. And so really the resolution there, in my view, is to go to the Texas Water Development Board and support their state water plan that strategically identifies the highest priority reservoirs or projects that need to be constructed to ensure we have proper water available for all citizens, urban and rural, because we obviously want to avoid being put in a situation like we nearly were in 2011, where we simply don't have enough water to meet all the demands. So proper mitigation, proper planning will avoid, in funding those plans, will avoid a situation where we're short on water.
I think the representative's comments just kind of reflect something that we talked about before, the significant difference in the diversity of the state. Where I'm from, water quality is a huge issue. Most of our aquifers and our natural resources are developed from our aquifers. They're karst features. We're having huge growth impacts in a mega region between Austin and San Antonio, the fastest growing region in America, to where we're really starting to challenge and ask questions about all these new wastewater issues that are coming about, that talk about discharging into our creeks and our rivers that are all naturally spring fed. That's not acceptable to me, not acceptable to a lot of people in those areas. But the permitting process at the state, there's not really a box to check a permit that specifically makes sense for those areas in Central Texas and those types of features. And so I think that's where we can work on different things. Again, the diversity of our state and how different things are made up. Other people have quality issues, some have quantity, some have both. But the environment itself is so different, whether you're in the Valley or East Texas or Central Texas or around, that I think our laws and our permitting needs to reflect the uniqueness and what makes it special in those certain areas.
That is all the time that we have. I just want to thank the panel. We covered a lot of ground, not just infrastructure, but property taxes, school finance, good Republicans, smart Democrats. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your questions. We'll take about an 8-minute break and then get started with the next panel. Thank you.